Hello again, gamers. Welcome back to the Board Game Captain. I'm the Board Game Captain, and today I'm going to be counting down my favorite games, my top 10 favorite games of the 1990s. So I already did a top 10 games of the 1980s, so I decided I wanted to give the 90s some love. The 90s were when I really started to get more into hobby gaming. It's when a lot of us did because of games like Magic the Gathering, and also, of course, games like Settlers of Catan, which were the two big games that really spurred on the whole tabletop gaming revolution that took place in the 90s that has, been going all the way on till today. Before we get started today, though, I want to say that if you're in a position to and would like to help out the channel, there is a link to my Patreon in the description down below where you can get access to early videos as well as behind the scenes videos and even the ability to request review and tutorials for your favorite classic games. And if you'd like to get yourself some cool gamer gear, t-shirts, mugs, even a sticker, there is a link to my Teespring store in the description down below where you can get all the coolest Board Game Captain gamer gear. So, without much further ado, I'm just going to jump right into it and I'm going to count down my top 10 favorite games of the 1990s. Number 10. My number 10 favorite game of the 1990s is Colossal Arena. This is a really cool game. It's gone through a lot of editions, a lot of reprints. This is a game where you have a bunch of monsters and they're fighting out a battle in a big arena like the Roman Colosseum. But unlike what you might expect, you're not playing as those monsters. The general idea, when somebody tells you that's going on in a game, your expectation is, oh, I get to pick a monster and I fight with the other monsters. No, you are all playing people gambling on that, and you're betting which monster is going to win, and it's based on what cards you have, because basically each of you has a bit of inside knowledge. You know that you have certain cards and certain other cards are somewhere else, and basically like you're going to bet on the monsters that you really think you can help to survive that round, because you play number cards in each of the monsters, and the lowest number monster each round of the game gets knocked out. So if you know you have, for instance, the lowest number for a certain monster, you know you're not going to be betting on that. And what you want to do is the earlier you put a wager in, the more points it's worth at the end of the game. So if you wager all the way on the first round on a monster and that monster survives all the way to the end of the game, that's huge. On the other hand, later wagers are worth far less, but are obviously easier to make survive. You already know they've made it through several rounds before the end of the game. This game is a lot of fun. It's really interesting. It's a very different from what you might expect when you hear the theme of it. And it's a game that I'll still play today. And it's why I like it so much. It's why I made it to my top 10 favorite games. And it's why it's my number 10 on my top 10 favorite games of the 1990s. Number 9. My number 9 favorite game of the 1990s is a dungeon crawler, and it's a dungeon crawler that had an interesting gimmick with it when it first came out, and that gimmick was that it came with a VHS tape that had a little mini theatrical performance that kind of showed you what to expect the games to be like. This is Dragon Strike. So Dragon Strike was a dungeon crawler set in the Dungeons & Dragons universe. So like a few other of their games that came before it, you can think of it as like Dungeons & Dragons Light. It was a dungeon crawler board game with RPG aspects, but without being a full-on role-playing game. This game was tons of fun. Me and my brother used to play this game lots. We played through most of the adventures it came with. Sometimes one of us would be the game master while the other would actually control more than one character, and it was great. I remember they had a couple of really big monsters in here. There was a red dragon, and there was this big, like, half man, half scorpion monster. I can't remember what he was called. He was kind of centaurish, where his upper body was humanoid, and his bottom half was the big giant scorpion. This game was awesome. And the VHS tape was fun. I mean, you had a bunch of hammy actors hamming it up and playing out a fantasy adventure to give you an idea of what sort of stories you are going to get to play out. This one really makes the list just based on the number of times I played it, because My brother and and some of our friends as well literally played through every adventure they had in the game, and yeah, we adored it back in the day. And that's why it's my number 9 on my top 10 favorite games of the 1990s. Number 8. My number 8 game is another one that I absolutely played the crap out of. This is one that for a very long time was a regular event. Saturday morning, my brother and I would be on the living room carpet playing this game weekly, and that is Battle Masters. Now, the reason we had to play it on the carpet was that it had this giant rollout map that we didn't really have a table big enough for because it was huge. This game was based on the Warhammer Fantasy universe, but it was kind of like a Warhammer Fantasy light. It used a hex-based map where you would fight out the battles. You had a good side and an evil side, and they all had lots of units, and I remember that each one had one ultimate unit. The evil side had a big ogre who was super powerful, and he had a deck of cards that he would use where he would randomly move or attack, and you wanted to set him up where he'd be close enough to the enemies where when you got to activate the ogre, you could be like move, attack, and smash some bad guys. Whereas the good guys had a cannon, and they had a deck of tiles that they would place out in the path they went in to try to blow up the enemy, and sometimes along the way the cannonball would bounce before exploding, which would cause damage to enemies on the way to the target. This game was tons of fun. It was, like I say, a lighter war strategy game, but you got to play at an entire fantasy battle with custom dice and all these miniatures on these movement trays as you move them around, and like moved your cavalry and your infantry around and fought with each other. And there was a big plastic tower you could put somewhere based on the different scenarios that you could play. Battle Masters was awesome, and my brother and I played tons of it, and there was no doubt in my mind when I was making this list that this game was going to be on the list. This was also, by the way, one of the games that was part of that partnership between Milton Bradley and Games Workshop that also earlier had produced Hero Quest. Though actually this is a game I liked even better than Hero Quest because I played it a lot more. And that is Battle Masters, and that's why it makes it down to my number 8 favorite game from the 1990s. Number 7. My number 7 favorite game from the 1990s is also a war strategy game, but a very different sort of one, because this one simulates dogfighting in an alternate history kind of gas punk universe, and that is Crimson Skies. So I loved the thematic nature of Crimson Skies. Basically, all of the United States have broken up after a second civil war that shattered the country, and each state, as well as some areas that are still held by Native American tribes that managed to survive because of how the United States had broken up, each has now become its own nation. And they're constantly fighting it out for territory. And because ground travel is difficult, many of the battles are done via these big air fights where you have Zeppelins and you have these super powered up propeller aircraft that are way more powerful than the ones at the time because of the constant warfare. There's been huge drives to develop military technology, and this is supposed to take place around like the World War I time period, except that the technology is gas punk and it is more advanced. They made a video game in this universe, and I have that as well, but the original board game was really cool, and it was made by FASA, who were very famous for having made Battletech, and this was another hex map based game. It was super awesome and super fun, and they also included a system just like with Battletech to design your own planes, and that was great. This is a game that I wish I still had my copy of because I really loved it back in the day. The artwork on it was beautiful. The creativity behind it and the ability to make your own planes was freaking awesome. And this game was tons of fun. And my favorite scenario always to play out was the 2 Zeppelins, one on either side, and some planes. And you were trying to knock out your opponent's Zeppelin. This game was freaking fantastic. And that is Crimson Skies. And that's why it is my number 7 favorite game from the 1990s. Number 6. My number 6 favorite game from the 1990s is a game that has to be the one on this list that I played the most number of times, because I don't even know it's possible to count the number of times in the 90s and then even in the 2000s that I played this game. It was insane. This is the game that literally defined the decade of the 1990s for tabletop games. It's still in print. It still gets expansions. It is Magic the Gathering. This game changed how people looked at tabletop games, and it was a phenomenon. It has become a staple of gaming culture. There's no way you haven't heard of Magic the Gathering. But I got into it in around 93, fairly early, and there were a few base sets in, but the first few sets had gone through really, really quickly, and I got into it when people in my area were getting into it, and before that I had never even heard of anything like it. I mean, it was the first ever collectible card game. No one had seen anything like it before, and it really blew our minds, the whole format, and everybody was spending all of their lawn mowing money on Magic the Gathering cards in the early to mid 90s. It's just what you did, and you played tons of games, and you traded cards, and you had fantasy battles, and you had I used to my main color back in the day was red, so I had lots of like Rocks of Kerr Ridges and Siobhan Dragons, and I also had Granite Gargoyles, and I would battle it out and throw fireballs and cast Disintegrates, and Fork. I loved the spell Fork because it just allowed you to double another powerful spell. I once played a game, a 3-player game, where we wound up in this big stalemate until I threw out a giant fireball that no one was able to counterspell, and I forked it and killed both the other 2 players. Yeah, Magic the Gathering is a game that if it did not make my list, there would be something wrong with my list. And that's why it is my number 6 favorite game of the 1990s, though probably if I had made the list in the 90s, it probably would have been my number 1 back then. And that's Magic the Gathering. Number 5. My number 5 favorite game of the 1990s is an abstract strategy game from what is probably my favorite series of abstract strategy games of all time. It's from the Gift Project series. This is actually my second favorite game in the entirety of the Gift Project, and that is Xerx. So Xerx is this fantastic game where you're placing marbles on the board while you remove pieces of the board, so it shrinks slowly, unless you start a turn where some of the marbles are next to each other, in which case you have to jump the marbles. Any marbles you jump, you capture. You can make multiple jumps. You can double or triple jump. You capture those and put them on the piece of the board that you have already removed. You play until you set collected 3 of each color marble, or 4 of the white marbles, or 5 of the grays, or 6 of the blacks. The smaller number needed is because there are less white marbles total and most of the black marbles total, so you need more of them to win. This is an amazingly awesome abstract strategy game. It's definitely one of my favorite abstracts of all time, and it's one I definitely still play today. It is one that is really great to take with you to the coffee house or pub because you can put it all in a bag because of how the board is really just a bunch of little rings, so you can put them all into the little bag it comes with and take it with you wherever you want to go and want to play it. This is a phenomenal game, and it's why Xerx is my number 5 favorite game from the decade of the 1990s. Number 4. My number 4 favorite game from the 1990s is actually kind of like an add-on to a classic game in a way. It is Nightmare Chess. So the thing about Nightmare Chess is it does not come with a chess set. You need to already have a chess set to play. Nightmare Chess comes with a deck of cards that you can play with your opponent. There's multiple ways to play. You can either just make like a whole deck and both of you draw cards and constantly get cool abilities, or they have point values and each of you can decide to get your own set of Nightmare Chess and then agree to a point value and make a deck based on that point value and verse each other, and then therefore have custom decks. Either way, this game is phenomenal. Nightmare Chess is awesome. Nightmare Chess is still in print. They made the most recent edition includes also the cards from the expansion that they had done. This is a game I played tons of over the years. I played it with tons of different people, and I love it. I love the special abilities. I love being able to sacrifice pieces to blow other pieces up. I love being able to change how pieces move. It feels like the designer took chess and Magic the Gathering and merged them. And that's why Nightmare Chess is so awesome. So that is why Nightmare Chess is my number 4 favorite game from the decade of the 1990s. Number 3. My number 3 favorite game of the 1990s is one I found much more recently. I never actually played it back in the 90s. I played it more recently when it was reprinted and loved it and wished I had played it back in the 90s when it first came out, and that is Torres. Torres is a game where you have 3-dimensional castles and towers. The word Torres in Spanish literally means towers, where you are building these towers and trying to win by having your game pieces on the tallest towers with the largest bases, because there's a bit of a multiplication for point value in there. This game is really awesome. Torres is tons of fun. The mathematical scoring is really awesome. There winds up being parts of the game where you're just looking around and you're multiplying the size of the base of a castle, but the height of the castle to figure out, am I better off here, or should I take an action and move my character down and move them over there? Are they going to get more points over there? You're also constantly growing the castles and making them larger and larger. This game is super fun. Caveat, you have to like doing math in games because there is tons of math in here. Lynn is not a fan of this one because she's not a fan of all the math it makes you do. There's tons of multiplication in it. But actually, in that regard, this is a game I would highly recommend to parents to play with kids who are at that level where they're learning mathematics, where they're learning multiplication specifically, because the game forces you to do multiplication. They may not even realize it while they're playing the game. You start playing the game, you're doing multiplication problems constantly to figure out where you get the most points. So getting better at the game means you get better at multiplication. And that's pretty awesome. So that is why Torres is my number 3 favorite game from the 1990s. Number 2. My number 2 favorite game from the 1990s is another one that I did not discover in the 1990s. I discovered it more recently with a newer updated edition of it, and it is Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage. Now, the newer edition that I have gotten is Hannibal and Hamilcar, because they added in a second board on the back of the first board and a second group of scenarios to play out the battles from the first Punic War, whereas the original game only played out the second Punic War. Now, that being said, that part of the game is freaking awesome. I love playing out the set battles of the second Punic War. I love to be Hannibal and make him win the second Punic War. It's difficult, but it's a challenge I'm willing to take up. This is a war strategy game, but done in a different sort of way, because you can't really take and hold whole areas. You have armies that you have to march around, and you don't really have enough armies to hold entire nations, entire areas, which is kind of how it was during the Punic Wars. So there's a lot of outmaneuvering your opponents, moving around and taking areas, taking them back, fighting sieges over certain areas, recruiting troops, and gaining points for trying to have control over certain very large entire regions, which will give you lots of points. You're trying to earn the most points by the end of the Punic War to win either in this case, for the original version, the second Punic War. This game is tons of fun. I absolutely adore it. I wish I had discovered it back in the 90s, because I would have loved it back then too. But I have it now, and it's a fantastic game, and I really adore it now. And that is Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage, my number 2 favorite game from the 1990s. And now it is time for number 1. My number 1 favorite game from the 1990s is a game I discovered back when it first came out in the very late 90s. And they just made a new edition of it where they even improved on it. This is Starfarers of Catan. Now, while I don't think the original Catan is still good enough to make my list, Starfarers of Catan is a game that holds up. The new edition, by the way, is now called Catan Starfarers. But either way, the original or the new version, the gameplay is great. It's way better than, in my opinion, any of the other versions of Catan. This game is still, both versions, my favorite version of Catan. The game is absolutely awesome, and when we got it, this is the game that really started me and my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, having board game nights. We would invite people and we would have game nights and we would play Starfarers of Catan, and then we started getting more modern games and really having big game nights together with other couples. And that is awesome, because that is obviously a tradition I have continued on to today. And the new edition of it we got, and we rekindled all that love of the game with the new edition, which like I said, I even think improved on some of the things from the old edition, even though I love the old edition as it was. The only problems with it being that a lot of my pieces from the old edition are broken now, and I can't really play my copy of the old edition, so I'm glad to have the reprint. This is one I highly recommend you go out and buy now, which again, the new version is Catan Starfarers. But the original version from the 90s was Starfarers of Catan, where you colonize planets, you make trade deals with alien civilizations to get yourself extra powers, and you try to gain the most resources and make the most money and get the most points by the end of the game to win the game of Starfarers of Catan. And it is freaking awesome. There you have it. Those are my top 10 favorite games from the 1990s. If you have any favorite games from the 1990s that didn't make my list that you'd like to tell me about, comment in the description down below. Let me know. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see me do more top 10 lists like this, maybe I'll do a top 10 games of the 2000s. Be sure to give this video a like, share it on all forms of social media, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Board Game Captain. That's Captain spelled with a K on YouTube. And until next time, game on.